Hey, I almost waited long enough to not get interrupted by the robot, but I missed it just barely. Good to see everybody. Thanks for joining this afternoon. We'll talk about end of year fundraising because somehow it is the second half of October. We also should all process that somehow. So, but excited to talk to y'all today. Excited to talk about end of year with y'all. Excited to introduce our panelists here in just a second. A couple of housekeeping things. We will record this, so don't feel like you have to take copious notes. You can engage in the conversation. We will ask you in general to stay on mute, but if you have questions throughout, feel free to chat those at any time. The panelists and myself will be watching the chat kind of actively and answer those as they come up, or at the end of our time today. And we also will save time at the end of our chat today for questions as well. Feel free to go ahead, and if you have a chance, just introduce yourself and your organization in the chat, so our panelists have a little sense of who's in the virtual space. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. For those of y'all who don't know, my name is Matt Gayer, co-executive director at the catalog. Excited to have our three panelists with us today to talk from some different perspectives about end of year fundraising. So I'll let each of them introduce themselves. And Holly, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. Hi. Thank you so much, everybody, for having me. This is a nice homecoming, as I actually used to work for the Catalog for Philanthropy as their development manager years ago. So I always enjoy coming back and getting to reconnect with this community. I am now a director with Thread Strategies. We are a Washington, D.C.-based fundraising consulting firm. We're a team of 7, all women, and our specialty is working with small and mid-sized nonprofits and really encouraging them and giving them the confidence, skills, and structure to fundraise according to those industry best practices that the really big dogs out there are doing. And there's absolutely no reason that small and mid-sized nonprofits also can't be fundraising to those standards of excellence. So we do everything from development assessments and strategy to systems and CRM selection and migrations, as well as hiring support. So thank you again for having me today.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Megan?
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Shpak. I am currently the operations manager at Kid Museum. I was formerly the development manager. I've kind of been doing a little bit of both since I've transitioned. And we are a STEM-based organization that is out of Bethesda, Maryland. And we focus really on elementary and middle school STEM education for children. And we are actually in the process of opening up a brand new location in downtown Bethesda. So we are in the process of changing our budget lines and everything like that. So fundraising is definitely looking a lot different this year than last year, which even last year was a little crazy for everyone. So happy to be here.
Great. Thank you. And Nadine?
Hi, everyone. I'm Nadine Gabai-Botero. I am president of Focus Fundraising, and we are a consulting firm of 7 also women, because we know how to do a lot of stuff. And we focus on a lot of small and mid-sized organizations, helping them really improve their fundraising. We're particularly emphasizing major gifts. So whether you don't have a program and you want to get into it, or you have a program and really want to take it to the next level, oftentimes even looking at campaigns, capital campaigns, how to prepare feasibility studies, do prospect research and assessments as well. So looking forward to diving in and talking about year end, because here we are again.
Definitely. Great. Nadine is also an amazing board member at the catalog, so I can't go without saying thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's been a really great experience.
So, starting off, for there might be 1 or 2 folks online who are kind of actively in their end of year, right? Maybe launched with an event. Everyone's definitely thinking of it. So just when you think of end of year, can mean a lot of different things to a lot of our folks. So what's kind of the timeline and the big aspects of end of year when you actually are thinking about end of year for the folks you work with or for your organization? And Holly, you want to kick us off?
Sure. So when we think about end of year, we're actually thinking really about a 6-month timeline, which is August to January. So whereas the bulk of your actual solicitation and your very active fundraising activity is going to be within that October to December timeframe, really the planning we like to start kicking that off in August to start with that review of what happened last year. What lessons learned do you want to remember and make sure that you either apply those things that went well again, or stay 20 feet away from the things that you just thought were crash and burn situations, or maybe they just weren't that great. They didn't have to be crash and burns. So planning is really August and September, where you're figuring out, what do you want to do? What's your goal? Your gift tables, who are you going to be asking, your messaging. It's also all of the logistics of coordinating with your mail house if you're going to be using one. What timelines do they need to be running on this year, given their client load, what the US Postal Service is doing. If you need to be working with a graphic designer or a videographer, also getting them set up. So that's why we really suggest starting off in that August, September timeframe for your planning. And then it's October through December, where we're seeing that majority of your fundraising actions, from cultivation and priming your community to be thinking about you, to be excited, to be aware of your goal, making those active solicitations. And then when it comes down through the end of the line to January, you get to the new year, you're so excited, but you can't let your foot off the gas. You have to steward. So in January, we really want to remind folks that you've got to have planned outreaches for how you want to connect your community to the campaign and the goals you just set, as well as doing the all important work of doing a wrap-up report. Put down on paper and record what were your lessons learned from this year, because it makes next year's planning that much more expedited and one step ahead when you're not trying to recreate what happened.
And the only thing I might add, and I absolutely agree, August is, surprisingly, it's so hot. You're like, how am I thinking about the holidays? But you really do. If you haven't started yet, don't despair. I have worked with groups that are starting now. So really, I think it's just a more tightened time frame. And you may not have, you don't have that runway to say, oh, well, this vendor's not ready, let me go with that one. So hopefully you have some of that in place. I would also focus a lot on your messaging in terms of what are the, Holly talked about some of those themes, but really also thinking about, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but when you're diving in, how can you find what is that bigger theme about your work, your mission, your vision, and then what are those strands that you can then take donors, what kind of, in a sense, I like thinking of this as a story, a sort of multifaceted story. And some of the snippets are in social media, and some of the longer stories might be in an email or a mailed letter. But what story is going to compel, and then how do you build around that?
I absolutely agree with everything Holly and Nadine had said. I will say, as a local organization that last year, we were trying to get through everything like everybody else, and we did start around this time in October. So definitely you can do it, and you can get through it. I absolutely recommend the earlier the better, obviously, but also you can, there are multiple ways to go about this, whether you're doing physical mailings or email marketing. So figuring out, if you do have a shortened, runway to work with, figuring out what is going to be the most bang for your buck, as for reaching your, audience and, your constituents.
Yeah, thanks all for sharing. Sorry, Matt had to restart internet, so I'm gonna fill in just for a little bit. So the next question that we had some people ask us ahead of time is just, how would you recommend differentiating messages for Giving Tuesday versus end of year, and like making sure that one flows into the next one appropriately? I don't know if Holly, you had something you wanted to start with, or that you're used to for Giving Tuesday?
Yeah. Well, I think my first reaction to this question is to say that your real first question to yourself is, do you need to differentiate your Giving Tuesday from your end of year messaging? There are certain cases and for certain campaigns where it really makes a lot of sense that end of year messaging is different from your Giving Tuesday, and that you have very differentiated stories, you're going after different goals, and that those are complementary but unique efforts. There are other campaigns for which organizations like to approach Giving Tuesday as the launch of their larger, very active solicitation phase of their campaign. So it's really sort of the first big kickoff moment of storytelling, that some organizations approach it that way. So I would first ask yourself, for the overall logic of your campaign, do you need separated messaging, or do you want them to be, as Nadine was sort of speaking to, phased increments of a larger narrative trajectory that you're taking your people on with you. The other thing that strikes me about Giving Tuesday and in terms of how you approach messaging is I think a lot of organizations still want to think about Giving Tuesday first and foremost as a revenue opportunity, which it absolutely is, right? It's a huge fundraising day. But if it doesn't make sense for your campaign, for whatever reason, to be focusing on revenue, then don't give up on Giving Tuesday as an opportunity to connect, but maybe you make it a stewardship campaign where it's all about saying thank you. And so you're helping to prime folks, or maybe you make it an email acquisition campaign day, where for folks for whom you have physical addresses, you're trying to get their emails, or vice versa. Maybe it's a physical address acquisition campaign that for folks for whom you have emails, you're trying to ask them to get their physical mailing addresses. So I think there's lots of ways to approach it, and what your goal is for Giving Tuesday is also going to influence how you structure that storytelling and what it's talking to and what it's talking about.
I'm going to add a couple of things and completely agree with Holly, but I will say two. One, Giving Tuesday is not for everyone. And I love Giving Tuesday, and it's always part of the conversation when we talk about how to sort of approach year end. But I think there's a lot of organizations who either don't have a social media presence, they don't have a big digital list. There's a lot of elements for whom then they're going to spend a lot of time and energy and not get anything back. So I think before we even go forward with what's your strategy, I think the question is Giving Tuesday a right element and a right tactic to use for your year end? The other piece, and it's funny because I was just having this conversation with a client this morning, talking about, Giving Tuesday is less about the story about your mission than it is about sort of, it's like the cheerleader of year end. And so recognizing that this is not where you tell the deep, dark, not dark, but the deep, long story about maybe some of your recipients of your services. It's really more about kind of, this is the time. I mean, for instance, match challenges at Giving Tuesday are really effective. So if you only have one small, maybe one donor is able to, offer $1,000 or $2,500, Giving Tuesday may be that time. If you do have a presence on social media, this is the time to use it. So it's a little bit of a nuance element, but I would consider that as well. It's sort of like, what are those tactics you'll use to really go out strong if you're going with Giving Tuesday?
Yep.
I absolutely, again, agree with both what you said. I will add that I found that last year we put out too many messages. So one of the things that we're trying to do this year is really kind of pull back on the amount of messages that we are putting out. So kind of being very thoughtful about those messages that you do want to connect, and making sure that you're not confusing donors and people who are new to your organization. You always want to introduce them to who you are as fast as you can, and kind of like a Cliff Notes version. But Giving Tuesday can be that opportunity for you to reintroduce yourself to donors and new individuals, and then continue with your messaging through your year-end campaign. So that's our target for this year. But
Megan, I have a question. What was your marker that said we put out too many messages? Did you start seeing a higher unsubscribe, or did you get notes from donors saying what the hell, or like, sorry, but
yeah, no, that's a great question. So we were keeping I was very detailed about our acceptance rate, our email open rate, our donations that we received back. We did do audience segmentation last year. So we were targeting a bunch of donors who had never actually given but have participated in our programming before. So we did a bunch of segmentations, and I was trying to do some research after our campaign was over. So once we were done with year end, we went back and looked at kind of where we could tighten things up, and figured out that we had way too many messages that we were putting out there, and it was probably a little confusing.
We had one question, and some folks asked this question around Giving Tuesday. Some asked about their events, some asked in general. So I'll just kind of put them all together. But if you have a donor or donors that maybe have given, either relatively substantial gift, whatever that means, to the organization at Giving Tuesday or at their event in September, October, or just in general gave you a gift in August or September. How close to that, or how do you decide if those donors are also included in your end of year campaign? Is a question a couple folks have.
Yeah, that's a great question. I usually try to counsel my clients. Typically, a lot of them do September appeals, end of September appeals even, and that's fine. I like the October buffer, to be honest. I like to hold off, and I know there are some events, catalog included, has an event, big event in early November. So it's tough because some of them may be giving then. If September is the time, I think it's perfectly fine to come into end of year with an ask without any kind of caveat or what have you. If you've just done something in early November, you may want to tailor that letter like Megan was talking about. So in that case, you would segment. Let's just say you have an event or you did some kind of something where you got an influx of donations in early November, then you may say to those folks, thank you so much for all that you've done. If you're able, I hope you'll consider a gift of such and such. So you don't want to, and I see it a lot, and frankly, I just think it's bad form where it's just like ask and then ask again, and oh, by the way, thank you, and by the way, ask again. And I know that there's probably evidence that shows that yes, you'll get more, but will you keep those relationships? Are you forming a tie that feels true and right for your organization? I don't know. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that last part in the relational piece is a really good point too, because a lot of times we talk about some of those large nonprofit strategies that don't always translate to the small nonprofit world is because they have 100,000 people on their donor list, right? They can lose 1% if they upgrade a few, whereas we obviously are working more relationally with our donors, both from a values perspective, but also just a numbers game. That's a really good point as well.
That's a really good point about the difference between a smaller versus the larger, with just, and they've got acquisition campaigns going all the time, and they've got new names just coming up the pipe. Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit, we had a couple of folks asking about theme for this year. I know you all were talking a little bit about this already. So when you're thinking about theme for this year, both this feels like 2 years in a row now, right? But like 2021 is a very unique year with the things going on. But also we obviously had probably some really unique messaging last year. So how do you balance kind of having a message for the moment, but also a message that taps into your kind of evergreen mission? And I don't know if anyone wants to start, because I know it's a big question, but Megan, maybe as you all have been planning, kind of what direction are you all going this year?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think we are kind of like in that sweet spot of really tapping into our evergreen, as you said, and really sticking with the moment. And our, program based is really around bringing STEM to children of elementary and middle school age and activating high schoolers to come and teach the younger grades. So when you look at that, core responsibility and what the pandemic has done to, all of our children, that is so important now more than ever, that we want to make sure that we are getting children to use their hands, to use their brains, to work together to overcome adversity, and to really tap into those populations that are underserved. So we are tapping into that because of the pandemic, but we also do that when there isn't a pandemic. So it kind of blends together a little bit, where you want to connect those things, where what your organization was doing prior to the pandemic and how that has maybe shifted a little bit, or maybe elevated exactly what you're doing for your community.
Yeah, I'll jump in and add that I think for this year, and we've sat in on a number of other webinars hosted by other folks across the industry and sort of are getting a sense of what lots of folks are saying. And I think overall, this really is a year to lean in heavily into your vision and your forward momentum. And that, we are not out of this tunnel by any stretch of the imagination, but we are certainly closer to the end than we were last year. And that I think the moment for doom and gloom and, oh my goodness, our doors are going to shut if you don't come up, that was a very poignant messaging line for last year. I think we are progressed enough and have had enough time where you've had to adapt, you've had to evolve, you've had to make hard decisions, that if you are still in a real budget pinch situation, that at this juncture is more sort of a you problem than a donor problem. And that it is not a particularly compelling line of messaging to present to folks. Rather, I think overall folks really want to be connected into where are we going next? Like, where are we, as we still nod to the external circumstances that impact us all and that we are still all living underneath, where do we still want to go? What are we excited about still? You want to give people a sense of momentum and vision, and that there's more happening and not just treading water. So I think that as much as you can work with your leadership, your program people, to find those things about what you want to strategize and prioritize for 2022 moving forward, and then communicate that outwards. Have those internal those conversations to constellate what your leadership is willing to publicly say about where you want to go. Because I think this is a moment where we are no longer all treading water anymore. And that a lot is the same, but a lot is also different. So taking that same sort of catastrophe, chicken little sky is falling messaging that worked in moments during the early phases of the pandemic, those have sunset.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add there is I have a lot of organizations, maybe some of you are in this boat, that did strategic planning over the last year. They kind of took the opportunity, things were a little bit quieter or what have you. The challenge is, what you don't want to do is bring your whole bucket of everything you're doing to your year end, because it's confusing, it's too much information. So you still need to select what are those things that are going to be particularly exciting to your donors and your prospects. Where do you feel like you can kind of connect with them? So once you've done that work to look forward and be positive, then select the few, and particularly where can you tell stories? Let's not forget about the importance of storytelling. That was such a buzzword back in 2019, before we kind of dropped into this world. But what are those stories that you can identify from your community that really shares both what the challenges they felt and also where some of the opportunities that you've had to make a difference in the communities, whether they are broader, more national or local, but thinking about those.
If I can jump in with one more thought that Nadine just inspired for me. I think I love her point about selection, and that you don't want to present the whole kitchen sink to your folks, right? Like, that presents confusion, that's too much, you've got to select. But I think also within that, it's not to say that you have to have a restricted ask at your end, that you're fundraising for one particular restricted program or anything, especially if your real need is general operating support, then you need to fundraise for general operating support, but you need to find a way to talk about that specifically. So rather than just rely on that general messaging of, please support our mission, you need to find of what way do you want to lean into your current work this year that you can be specific about, that you connect. And maybe it's that you're really trying to connect people into a value or a feeling that this year we are really going to prioritize connectivity, which is something we always do. But this is the way that we're really excited. 2022 will be our year of connectivity. But you have to find some way to specify and give that selected, really narrow lane of connection for your folks, even if it's a general operating support ask, which the vast majority of organizations are asking for general operating support at year end. So I do not want to give the impression that we're saying you have to fundraise for restricted dollars to be successful that way.
Great point. Yep.
Definitely. And it sounds then, because those kind of similarly, not surprisingly, I had questions around tone of those kind of messages. It sounds like that cautious optimism is kind of where y'all are landing, or maybe just pure optimism around kind of growth direction. And is that kind of what it feels like y'all are working on? Tone.
Yeah. The challenge is, if you're too optimistic, like everything's rosy, then you may give the impression that you don't need us as a donor. So I think it's the optimistic, like, even with all of these challenges and roadblocks, look at what we've accomplished. And even though there's so much uncertainty, look at what we're still committed to doing. So do you see the nuance of that? I think that's the key, is couching your optimism in we're still, there's struggles here. It's not all roses, but with your help, you can help us do X and Y. So I think that's it's a nuance, but I think you can get there.
I think another way to approach tone, and there's a lot of work being done around philanthropic psychology coming out of the Institute for Sustainable Development, which is based out of the UK. And where they really have been leaning into, and we've been experimenting with our partners and are seeing some good success, is to think about and make a list of what are the values or the emotions that you want your donors to feel during your campaign. Do you want them to feel pride? Do you want them to feel determination? Do you want them to feel relentless? Do you want them to feel connected, empathetic, thoughtful, curious? And when you then sit down to write your messaging, think about how you're writing and are you evoking those values or emotions? Because a lot of fundraising messaging you can think about coming back to is a form of identity work. When I donate to a cause, it's because I'm expressing some reflection of my values of what I think is important in this world. What do I want to see be bettered? What do I want to see be changed? And so if you think about writing as also an emotional act where you're trying to connect people to specific values, I think it gives you some space to tap into different modes of feeling beyond just sort of that raw, pure, maybe Ted Lasso optimism, but like Ted Lasso has baggage. And so it's okay to get into that, but I think you can sort of open up other opportunities in your tone when you've identified with your team, how do we want people, what values or emotions do we really want to evoke out of our messaging this year?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And also, any reference to Ted Lasso is always going to win me over there. So
Yeah,
I got it too. So
football is life.
great show, right? Yeah. So switching gears a bit to think about just kind of the tactics of end of year. We had a lot of folks asking about, they've had varied success with kind of email appeals versus direct mail appeals. Obviously, we know there's kind of pluses and minuses of both. When you think about setting up your end of year campaign and kind of sharing time and space between those two, what does that often look like for y'all? And again, maybe we'll start making specifically with y'all for kind of how you're thinking about balancing those two, and then hear the broader perspective.
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, I did like a lot of like data, scrubbing after our year end last year, and I was trying to figure out, one of the things I tested last year was figuring out if a lot of our donors do like physical mailings or do they want the email, and like which one we were receiving more donations from. And surprisingly, to my surprise, most of our donations came back through physical mail. So for us, I was very shocked by that. And so we know that we need to keep that up, but emailing, it's just an easy thing for us to do. So we're able to kind of combine both. So we are targeting to send out our physical mailing at the beginning of December. So that will be hopefully in the mailboxes, the first week or two of December. And we also have our yearly fundraiser. So it is Fet for the Future, which will also be at the beginning of December. So we have kind of like our event and our year-end campaign, sandwiched together. So with all of that going on, we want to make sure that we're not overdoing it with the emails, how much people are being contacted. So, really identifying and making sure that you're segmenting your donor list to make sure that you're not bombarding people with emails consistently for asking. And one thing that I will say was a huge thing for us last year was we sent out an email at, I think it was 5 o'clock on December 31st, and people were getting in like their last minute donations for the year. So that was another big, I will say that will probably stay a constant, is that last moment, getting your donations now, but also having a physical mailing to direct emails after that, and then that final simple push at the end of the month of December.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things building off what Megan said. The segmenting is so key. And I know it takes more work. I have worked with organizations that just look at me and they're like, I can't. And I get it. And we're not, going to make you crazy. But if you are going to do one thing differently this year and you didn't segment last year, try to segment. And what that means is figuring out some element of your donor base that you can say, you know what, all of these folks did this, came to an event, or responded to something, or haven't given this year. So that's the Libunts, the last year, but unfortunately not this year. So those donors. So pick something and say, you know what, to those donors, I'm gonna take this message that I already have. So we're not talking about a lot of work, but you're gonna just tweak that first sentence or two, and you're gonna send to them separately. And you're gonna, you know, one of the things about year end that is kind of cool, but you kind of have to get into it, which is like the data, understanding what you did, taking that time. And I loved how Holly talked about, you know, what do you do in January? And I think stewarding, absolutely. And that report that you talked about, and what goes into that report is the analysis. How did you do? Make sure you built in that time. And if you have a supervisor who's like, no, we got to hit the ground running with something due in February, you have to push back and say, I need to understand what just happened, because otherwise you're just going to be going round and round. So that's something that I would absolutely say try to do, both the segmenting and the analysis.
Yeah. To add my 2 thoughts to add to that. One, if you're sort of thinking about, well, what segment should I start with? I have all of these different options in front of me. Start with where you trust your data the most, where you are confident that the data is correct. That's where you start segmenting, right? Because there's nothing worse than trying to segment and figuring out that your data is messy, and then you've got these lists that just feel like Medusa, and then your donor is going to get something wrong, and like that has consequences down the line. So if you're not sure where to start segmenting, you start with where you trust your data the most. And that might be a lot of folks, that might be a very small segment. That's okay. Start with where you trust your data the most. The other thing that I wanted to point out as sort of a piece of homework that you can all go do after this is I really recommend that you Google a report from a group called Next After. They're a digital fundraising consulting firm based out of Austin, Texas. They do really interesting applied research in online fundraising. And they have a very interesting report out right now that's free for download called The State of Multi-Channel Fundraising. So if you just Google Next After State of Multi-Channel Fundraising, you're going to get some really, really interesting real world data points about why it's so important to talk to your donors in lots of different ways and at lots of different times, with the big upshot being that multi-channel donors, so folks that you talk to in both online and offline avenues, have a much greater lifetime value to your organization than just online donors or just direct mail folks. So we are 3D people living in a 3D world. I open as much mail as I open email. That's probably not true. I open more email. But I read my mail. I like go through my mail every day. So it is important to keep those elements and treat your people as real people, not just email addresses.
But one thing I'll add on that is I've had clients, multiple clients seeing this, that you will often mail to a list and you'll get email back as the response. So you're like, well, so-and-so didn't give in the mail, but that mailed piece may have had an impact in their decision to walk over to their computer and give. Another thing that I'm seeing more and more this year, and I think a little last year, but especially this year, you know how we're all so comfortable now going to a restaurant and just using the QR code to pull up the menu.
Yes.
So think about, can you add a QR code to your mailed piece? So that's all they have to do. Boom, they look at it, click it, and they're on your give page. So again, it's that multi-channel, and they're physically looking at that. Maybe they actually put it on their desk or in their kitchen or something, so they don't forget it, versus, you know, you close your email and suddenly you're down at the bottom of the email list. So just think about how you can kind of layer all those different pieces.
I will say that we used a QR code last year, and I was able to track how many people scanned it.
Nice.
And we actually had a good like 20 something people who actually scanned and donated via the QR code. So I definitely, if you could put it on your physical mailing, just like stick it in the bottom corner, you can make them for free. You just, you know, Google free QR code maker and you can make them for free. So
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a great point. We've seen people do that both some in-person events they've done is an easy way to donate, but also on their fundraising letters. And I think, again, it's something that folks would have looked at really weirdly in 2018 that now is an opportunity. That's a great point. The other thing I'll say there too, Nadine, what you were saying just reminds me also with the multi-channel piece is that, you know, we see actually increasingly the donor pool we're probably reaching out to, that kind of elder millennial Gen X group, be 100% the type of folks we're talking about, right? Like, not surprisingly, according to data, baby boomers and above like to receive stuff in the mail, donate via mail, and younger millennials and Gen Z like don't know what a checkbook is, right? So they want to donate online, get contact online, donate online. But that middle group wants to be contacted via direct mail, right? Because they still want to book over a Kindle, but like they have a checkbook that's like the back of the kitchen drawer, right? You don't really know where it is. That 100%, right, is real. So having them have an easy way to flow in between those different channels, really important. So that's great. One question folks had. Yeah.
Can I just add something? Because I don't know if you're going to get to it, but I just think it's important to talk about the phone. Let's not forget the phone when we talk about multi-channel. We've had an experience with a organization. It started this summer where we sort of jumped in and we're doing some outreach to their major donors. And the response to one of our fundraisers just picking up the phone and calling them has been overwhelming. And it's really interesting. There is a subset. Yes, they're probably older. So if your donor base is all super young, I get it. That's not for you. But, folks will pick up the phone. And that doesn't mean you have to email to set up a time and say, hey, can I call you tomorrow at 2? And guess what? They never got back to me. Just call them. You'd be surprised. So I just want to just put a plug in for the phone.
Love it. No, couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Well, and that was my next question, was especially kind of major donors. When you're thinking about phone, email, direct mail, another question related to not just kind of, which should we do, which is probably all, is like what order, like any advice on how to structure that, right? Of when they get the call versus when they get the letter versus when they get the emails, anything on pacing there. And maybe Nadine, if you have any thoughts there, we can start.
Sure.
There.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that I like starting with the letter. And Megan, I know you said it's going to drop in December because of your event, but I worry. Last year, I don't know if you all had this experience. It took like 3 weeks for some organizations to have their mail delivered. So if you can drop in November, I would highly encourage you. So, just because then that's happened. But I do like, start with a mail. And then maybe there is an email and then a call, something. And you could even, if you wanted to, you could reference, I'll be calling you in the next few weeks. I really just want to say, happy holidays and see if we can have a time to connect. So that could be if that makes you feel better. And, share the list around. If you've got a few kind of extroverted board members who are willing, you can give them a call script and say, hey, if you're not comfortable asking, that's fine. But just do a touch point. We're wishing you a happy holiday. It's about that multi-layered elements.
And I think the other thing that happens on your phone is texting. You can absolutely also text folks, and you don't have to have some really big fancy text to donate software, although those things are out there and they are wonderful and they are increasingly effective. But if you've got phone numbers that are cell numbers and your folks are more comfortable texting, that is still a multi-channel moment, even if it's text-based and narrative as opposed to verbal. And for some, especially if you're enlisting the help of volunteers, be them board members, program ambassadors, whoever, that might be a little bit shy about actually talking on the phone, then I'm sure they can text.
That's absolutely right. And I see your point, Holly, just put in the chat that USPS, and you're right, they have already announced there's going to be a slowdown. So all the more reason to make sure you've gotten that sort of that element thought through. And there's a lot of elements when it comes to the mail. You really want to use a live stamp versus a postage machine. There are evidence that gets opened more readily. Have a reply device, whether it's part of the letter or a separate card. Try to have the QR code. All of these things kind of are part of what having an effective sort of mail piece.
Definitely. Before I forget, someone had asked during our conversation around segmenting, specifically kind of segmenting, but from a strategic perspective of, not your kind of top, 10, 15 donors. We know we're handling them very differently, but when you think about segmenting, if they're segmenting by kind of donation value or donation ranges, does anything change in your strategy there for those different donation levels about, communicating more or less with certain levels, or the theme you're using, or is it really just you're changing some of the language, but they're getting kind of the same amount of communication?
jump in and say that I think they're largely getting the same amount of communication, because that $5 donation to you is as important as a mid-level one, as a major donor one, whatever you're defining those level as, because, you know, the vast majority of major donors, their first gift is at a small to mid-level amount, right? So they work up your pipeline. So I wouldn't say that for your $5 folks, you know, they're only getting email and they get less of it because they're less valuable. They're not. Like they have long-term value to you. I think the crux of the segmenting comes from being able to acknowledge and demonstrate to the donor that you know what they did before. You know what their pattern is, and you can acknowledge that and speak to that and say, hey, I know that you gave $10 last time, and that $10 really does do something, and thank you for it. And this time, if you can do that again, amazing. If you can go to 20, like super, super amazing. But the crux of the segmenting isn't necessarily that I think it changes volume or intensity of messaging. It's demonstration of, you know, what they've done before. You're exhibiting awareness of their pattern, and then getting them, and so, because that speaks more volumes to folks around like, oh, you do have a sense of who I am, how I've given before. If you can reference the date of their last gift, that's also very, very effective. So that not only have you bucketed them against their donation value, but you're saying, you know, that gift from back in August, man, that came at a good time. Thank you. So that's my take on it. Nadine or Megan, if you have additional or other thoughts.
Yeah, you know, the only thing I would say is, and I was looking at, you know, sort of the titles. I think most of us are development professionals. Some might be executive directors also doing development. But I think the way you incorporate and bring in your executive director or your board chair, I think is useful. And I think that might be someplace where you do differentiate. So somebody who's given, you know, $1,000 versus $250, you know, you don't have a lot of their time. So the time that you do have, you may say, okay, could you, executive director, call these people? Can you, as a board member, send emails to these people and make it as easy as possible for them? So draft the email that they just, you know, and you could say personalize, because maybe they know them. So let them add 2 sentences and you can't begin to figure out what that's going to be. And then you write that body of the email. So think strategically about who you have at the ready to help you, and then have that be part of it. Again, that's part of the multi-layer. So the emails come from you, but the calls may come from your executive director, and then a special email on the, you know, 29th or 31st is from somebody else. So think about that kind of strategically.
Yeah, I will say we did that last year, where we had our top, I think it was our top 50 donors. We asked every single one of our board members to take a few names. They took the letter that we were sending out anyway, and they wrote their own message on the letter and sent that in the mail. Every single one of those letters came back with a donation. So just having that extra touch point with, you know, whether they know them personally or, you know, them in the community, that can really make a large difference.
The last trick to that effect that I'll share that we really like is doing personalized forward email bumps. So let's say you send out one of your sort of general email solicitations going to maybe it's your whole listserv, the segmented piece of it. You then get a board member or whomever, even a program person, to forward that email one by one to a targeted list of donors. Maybe that's, you know, each, let's say I have 10, Nadine has 10, Megan has 10. And you just have them include a super easy one-line intro note that says, you know, hey, Matt, just wanted to ensure that you saw this email below. I really loved the story in it. I hope that you'll be able to lend your support. Thanks so much, Holly. And that is so easy to do, but it adds it's wonderful for a few reasons. One, it adds a very personalized touch that I'm getting emailed from a person. Two, I'm repurposing content. I don't have to write an entirely other new email to send to these folks. I've just included another touch point in my calendar using the same story that I've already used. And it is, so it's efficient. It's a really nice trick too, if you have folks who will help you with it.
Definitely. Well, and that's a great point. We had a few questions around emails, so we can dive into that. I will say that there was one quick question on the direct mail, you know, letter when you're mailing it out. Obviously, for emails, there are some questions about who they should come from, and we can talk about that in a second. But someone was asking, should the letter just always be from the executive director? Is there ever a time you send that from someone else at the organization?
if you're only doing one letter, it probably makes sense to have it be from the executive director. But I love the idea of having folks sign, do a personalizing. You can do a little, and kind of gathering and folks do some personalizing. If you can't get any people in person, which I know that still can be tricky, you can ask your board, let's say, to just take a stack of Post-its and send them who it's for and say who, and then just pop those Post-its into the mail to you, and you as the development person can just pop them on. So there's a way to do it that's like no touch kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. And a great idea there for right now. We have to get creative there. No, that's great. So on emails, just there were two questions here. One was just in general, we know obviously all of our donors, like all of us, are getting a ton of emails as always, if not more than usual. Any tips or tricks on doing stuff to kind of get their email to stand out? Any tips, tricks there on the open rates, right? Maybe what y'all have seen impact some open and click-throughs, anything like that.
Yeah, I have three thoughts if I can jump in to start. Thought number one is you get no credit for being quiet. Nobody's going to say, oh, thank you, Holly's Fine Nonprofit, for not contributing to the clog that is my inbox. So even if it feels more than you want to do and icky, you need to keep your email volume up over end of year because everybody else in the sector is too. So you don't want to cede your real estate to somebody else. You get no credit for being quiet. You want to be thoughtful and strategic about when and how you send those emails, but you probably want to be sending more than you normally, than your gut instinct would tell you to as a person. So that's my first thought. My second thought is, I feel very strongly about your emails coming from a person as the sender. So that it is my name, Holly Richardson, not Thread Strategies. We are very adept, as we've all gotten more sophisticated in our email habits, and it has become just, our third arm of life, or whatever weird metaphor I'm going to go after, that we're getting very quick at triaging when things come from people or when they come from email machines. An email machine always reads marketing, right? I always know I'm being sold to or asked if it feels like it's coming from an institution or an email machine rather than a person. So as much as you can use first and last names, and you can vary those up. Sometimes it can be the executive director. It could be a program person, depending on the story you're telling. It could be a stakeholder, a program ambassador, a board member. You can switch those up, but have it come from a person. The other thing that we've been tracking and experimenting with this year, started experimenting last year and really leaning into it this year, is having some of your emails go unformatted, where they look like plain text. And the thought behind this is that, again, as we've all gotten more sophisticated at email, if something has a branded template on it, I know it's coming from an institution, right? Or like an entity and not a person, because I, Holly, when I email my mom, don't use a branded template, right? I just send an email. So that this is not to say that all of your emails should go plain text, but experiment with dropping a few of them as simple plain text emails that really look like they are just from Nadine's Gmail account and not through the MailChimp. And there is, Next After has some research to say that in one of their studies, it increased open rates by 20% because it looked like a person, it really looked like a person was sending it and not an institution. So it's something to play with, not do 100%, but something to play with.
Great.
I will just add that the subject line is really important when you're doing email. Depending on the size of your list, you may try to do some A/B testing, which means half your list gets one subject line, half the list gets another. Everybody's list is different, and you have to kind of get to know your list. How do they respond? What are the things that get them to open? What are the things that get them to click and give? So doing some testing, doing some analysis, including their name in the subject line or not, shorter versus longer, certain words, etc. So I think trying different things is a good idea.
Yep. Definitely.
And then when you think about just getting to that, Holly, your point about sending more than you probably feel comfortable with, which I think is a great point, right? When we think about all the, in any type of election year, all the ridiculous amount of donation requests you get. Here's the thing, people do it because it works, right? They have marketers that paid a lot of money to research, knowing that works, right? So when you're thinking about volume, though, realistically, for a small nonprofit to send kind of during end of year, let's think specifically maybe like second half of November through December 31st, how many kind of touch points are you looking at often in regards to kind of your email communication to your donors?
I mean, I will answer that. I think it depends, but you could do 1 or even 2 a week. It depends on if what I think Holly's point of like up the ante. So whatever you do normally, increase. I usually counsel organizations to send at least 2 emails on the 31st. It is the biggest giving day of the year. You don't want to mess that up. I had a very big client had a really big mess up where it said dear, and instead of the personalized name, it all got like dear Jackie or something. And that was the last message. And we were all just like wanting to throw up. So be very careful. That is probably your most important message. But I would do 1 kind of late morning and then 1 at that like 5 sort of before they're going out for New Year's Eve kind of thing. But yeah, and keep your eye on the data, on the unsubscribes, on the donations. And if you start seeing those unsubscribes, then I would, ratchet back. And of course, it depends on how big your list is. Where is that discomfort level?
What I'll add to that, I completely agree with all of those points. What I would add to that is when you're thinking about the volume and the pacing that you do for the sort of November and December, it's not all asks. We recommend that it's sort of 60% asks, 40% cultivation or other touches. Just sharing out stories. Maybe this is finally when you get to do that donor survey you've been meaning to do forever. It's a testimonial. It's a thank you email. It's an announcement of some big news. But it shouldn't be ask, because that is going to get you unsubscribes. It should be ask and cultivate, ask, cultivate, ask, cultivate. Like you sort of mix and match those up a little bit. And you pace those and think about what other dates on the calendar are important for your organization. Do you have an event? How do you want to handle holidays? Do you like to give those wide buffer? Do you not mind sending something close to them? That really depends for you. The other thing that I think is crucial as a best practice at end of year for email is when somebody has responded to your email in November or December and made the donation you asked them to, you suppress them from future solicitations. So if I did you asked me to do the thing, donate, and I did the thing, stop asking me because I did the thing, right? So you need to get intimate with whatever your email marketing software is. Learn how to put together a list that you then tell the email marketer, do not send this email to these people. And that is largely a manual process for you, where on a weekly basis, you've got to get somebody doing that work. It's work. But donor suppression from future solicitations is a really great best practice. And it doesn't mean that you have to stop talking to those folks you then gave in November, December. You can just repurpose one of your solicitation stories as a thank you. Take out all the ask language and send them the story as a thank you instead.
Yeah. I will say that we did that last year, pulling our people who had donated and making sure that our email list got smaller and smaller and smaller. And we definitely saw an increase and a decrease of people who were unsubscribing. So definitely agree with that. And also, if anyone is having a year-end event that is like very close to your year-end giving, we parlayed like after our event, some of our messaging was like, thank you for coming to our event. Like, here's a link to view the event. And it was more just like a thank you that parlayed into that and continued with the asks later on. So that definitely was a good strategy for us last year as well.
Yeah, that's great. This is a question you probably could have also led with, but folks who are just in general, how y'all are feeling about end of year, going into this end of year, from some of the things you've seen, with donors you've worked with some of the nonprofits y'all have been working with across the year. Are you feeling kind of confident going into the year that donors are kind of as engaged as ever? Neutral, pessimistically, where you all at and kind of thinking about forecasting for end of year? And Holly, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. I feel good about this end of year. I don't think there's nothing indicating to me that it's going to be a down year and that we're going to see a big dip off of the performance of 2020, which was a surprise. I mean, everybody thought 2020 was going to be a hard hit year, and it was way up, not only over expectations, but over past performances too. And that was even with the additional Giving Tuesday Now that happened in May. And people really thought, oh, is that also going to suck additional oxygen out of the room? And it didn't. So I think the studies that I've seen about donor sentiment, et cetera, I think things are in a positive place. I think it is still the time where the best practices really matter, where you like learn how for every end of year season, I think you need to approach it as not only what is the fundraising goal that we're going to try and hit, but what is the organizational capacity that we're building this year. So maybe it's this year is the year of segmentation, or this year is the year of donor suppression for us. But whatever those best practices that show your donors that you're trying and you're here with them, and that they matter to you, I have every confidence that people are still coming along.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Holly. I think we're at the same kind of like neutral position, like going into last year, we're kind of still like seeing the same drive up into our end of year event. So I think our donor base is looking very neutral, if not gaining more, just specifically because of our expansion. There's been a lot of like drum up in our community, and that's another piece that we're doing, you know, for our organization personally. But we definitely have not seen any indication of it being a downturn.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think those for whom, you know, jobs have not had, you know, issues in terms of, you know, whether or not they're going to have a job, feel very fortunate. And so I think there's a lot of people, yes, there's a lot of people that were impacted by COVID. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of people that say, okay, you know, we have to give generously. And I think that sentiment still really does exist.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Great. I want to remind folks that are on, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat. We'll answer those as they come up. So we have a few questions left ourselves, the folks that submitted ahead of time, but feel free to ask any remaining questions for our panelists that we maybe haven't talked about, if you want to dive deeper on anything we've talked about today. One thing some folks were asking is that, you know, obviously they know ideally, Holly, as you mentioned earlier, this is, you know, a 6-month process, right? They got started in August. But let's say just, you know, for argument's sake, they were starting today and hadn't had time to begin end of year prep yet. What are some of those first things you'd recommend they're doing in preparation? You know, one thing we've said to our partners recently, I'll just say, is that those stories y'all are talking about are obviously harder to come by right now, possibly with programming being virtual, not being in the office with staff, so kind of working proactively to capture those. But what are some other things like that y'all recommend folks do as first steps to prepping for the enjoyable chaos that is end of year? Yeah, Nadine.
Yeah, I'll take that. You know, there's like 3 areas. There's the messaging that is so key that we talked about. There's the timeline. You've got to create a timeline, whether it's just sitting in a Google Doc or it's in an Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is, but think through all of the different elements and how it maps in the year. And then your list. So if you think of those 3 elements, I think, you know, the lists, who are going to get your major donor letter? Who's going to get the emails? What kind of, you know, work can you do on the social media side? So I think that's a good way to sort of start thinking about it and breaking it down.
Mm-hmm.
I can jump in. I'd say the only thing that I would add to Nadine's list is figure out what your goal is. You have to have a specific goal. Fundraising without that just sounds like, please support us. Long empty pause. And even if I love you and I think your work is fabulous and I'm into your impact and I want to help, I still want to be inspired. And a goal is that definition of success. It's going to help you define what that messaging is, because you're going to know how to talk about it. You're going to know how to ramp it up, and just define for yourself, like, oh, that's a story that matches what the goal is. And that story is a beautiful story, but we need to hold it because it's not the right moment to deploy it. So you got to do that work of a goal. And then the only other thing I'll do is just add a little bit of a plug that next week Thread is actually hosting a webinar on this very topic of sort of five last minute must-dos that we would recommend if you're getting started late on the game. But pretty much Nadine, her list hits a lot of them. And the only other thing I would say is, like, what's your plan for thanking? Make sure that you don't leave that out of the equation. And how are you going to follow up and keep people feeling that their choice to give, because it is always a choice, was indeed a very good one.
Mhm. I agree with all of that.
Fair enough. On kind of a flip side, someone was asking just kind of what have you seen maybe not work, or where do folks kind of go wrong at end of year? What would be a common pitfall that you've maybe seen folks have, or that maybe you've had in a previous end of year? I'll let anyone
Well,
start.
I mean, the story I told earlier of the, badly done name merge was a big gut punch on the 31st. And needless to say, we're no longer working with that firm, although they're a great firm. They just really dropped the ball. But, I think when it comes to, and I think Holly was talking about this earlier, understand and know your medium. So if you are working in MailChimp, if you are working in, whatever the tool is, feel confident. You have to do some tests. Don't just send things out until you've tested it. You've got to know what the procedures are.
I would say, just give yourself it's just a little bit more of a buffer than you think you need. So if you think you need a day buffer, give yourself a day and a half, just to make sure that you're not rushing, and that last minute rush is where things go wrong. And you want to avoid that. So I always try to give myself a 2-day buffer. So even if it does get shortened a little bit, I still feel like I can do everything, check everything once more before it really goes out to the masses, to avoid those big issues.
Yeah, my piece of advice is, I think end of year especially is the mantra of quality over quantity. But there are so many different tactics and strategies that you could deploy at end of year, and you should really pick the few that you think you can do well, especially if it's a new skill or a new capacity for your organization. End of year is not the time to suddenly try and figure out some brand new super shiny thing that you're interested in, but is a capacity push on your organization. Figure out what things you feel like you can do really, really well. And then for the things that you want to learn how to do and integrate into a future campaign, awesome. Learn how to do those things in the spring and the summer. Don't learn how to do them in November. Because that just gets hard. And that's when the gray hairs pop out of everybody's head.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add is doing yourself the favor, and especially I think around now, folks are starting to maybe create their annual plans for next year. Go ahead and put a pin in August to do the messaging for year end, to start thinking about year end. Back it out then, and do some, and have a meeting planned in September that is the lead meeting, or you and your executive director or what have you. But try to schedule it in so that you're not back against the wall if you're just starting out now. Give yourself more runway.
Great. We have one specific question, one broad question left. Then we'll see if anyone again has any questions they have. Feel free to put those in the chat. Specific question someone asked was, especially when thinking about those lower level donors that sometimes we gloss over a bit at end of year, what kind of advice do you have for the type of increase to ask from folks? Are you going back and asking for just what they gave last year? Are you moving your 10 to 25, your 100 to 150, whatever? And then how do you think about that increase without being too aggressive, but also still trying to not leave money on the table there?
I can jump in on this one. I think this is still overall a real weak point for the nonprofit sector, that personalized marketing and data analytics and artificial intelligence tracks around everything else that we all do on the internet. When I'm online shopping, if I'm on social media, if I'm consuming news, it is a personalized, tailored experience. And I think on the whole, the nonprofit sector has yet to invest in artificial intelligence to solve this problem for you. So that there are companies out there. We have partnered with a company called Arjuna Solutions, just to name one, out there that does have an AI product that will track your donors' giving behavior over time. And then it'll make the suggestion that actually $124 is the correct the optimal solicitation for that person, not 110. And an algorithm decided that, not me as a person trying to be an algorithm. So I think that is a long-term, like, have your eye on the ball, that maybe something down the line, as your organization considers what types of capacity it wants to bring on board, would that be something you want to invest in down the line? I don't think that's something you can just activate right now for end of year. So in terms of what you do right now for end of year, I think you have to make the decision on how to approach that from a capacity point of view. Do you have the time and the bandwidth to sit down and really look at your list and look at people's giving history, maybe over the past 1, 2, 3 years, and figure out what kind of upgrade you would want to ask of that person? And that is sort of a manual gut, half science, half art project, where you just sit and figure it out. If you don't have the capacity to do that, then I think making a blanket, 5%, 10%, like decide your percent increase against folks is sort of the best that you can do. Maybe you also just decide that you don't, that's above and like trying to make any sort of upgraded thing is above and beyond your capacity. And so you just leave it be and you just ask for what they gave last year. So I think it really is a capacity question overall, but I would encourage all organizations to be looking down the line to think the private sector is taking advantage of these tech solutions that the nonprofit sector is getting to. But where in your future is there maybe an opportunity where you could let the tech solve that problem for you? Knowing it's an investment, knowing that's like a leap, all the things, but those solutions exist.
Yeah, and I would say if you do have some capacity, but not a tremendous amount, and you have a big list, you can do something. First of all, I love ask strings. So especially if you're doing in a letter, X plus, some percentage or X plus a different percentage. And you can do, last year's gift, so most recent contribution, oftentimes MRC times, it could be, 1.25. So, and then you could say round it up to the nearest 5, 5 or 10, whatever you're comfortable with. So there's ways to do that. So then you do the mail merge and it just automatically puts that in there. And then you can do an eyeball. I mean, it's time consuming, but let's say you have a list of 1,000 names. Yeah. So you just take a few evenings and you're just going to go through it, or in the morning when you've had your coffee and you're bright and, whatever. And you just say, does this seem right? Or there are always going to be a few that you tweak. But I think I like to go in and ask a donor to stretch a bit, not a huge amount, unless it's somebody who has indicated to you, oh yeah, this year we really want to do something more or what have you. Yeah.
I will say, I think those are both great ideas. And last year, we were really short-staffed. I was kind of trying to pull all of this together. And one of the things that we did do was we changed the amount on our envelope to send back, the remittance envelope, is that we just increased that by $5 for each level. So it was, instead of $10, $15, and then we increased it just by $5. And that was just a simple way for us, like people could just check off like what they were doing, but it was a way to just kind of that blanket overall. So if you unfortunately don't have that capacity, which I hope everybody does find a little bit more time, but if you're really just looking for like a quick thing, that might be a simple, ad to do this year and see how you work out after.
Great. Well, we just have a couple minutes left, so I'll just ask one final quick question, because I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I do want to proactively thank all three of our panelists for being with us today. I really appreciate all y'all's time. As we all said, it's a busy time of year, so we know it's busy for y'all as well, and really appreciate it. Last question, we shared a lot of tips today. Folks are going to be taking back different things to their end of year campaigns. If you wanted folks to think about just one thing, if there's one thing to think about going into their end of year, it could be a very specific tip or just kind of an overall kind of mantra or element of it to think about. What would be that one piece of advice or tip you'd have for folks going into end of year this year? And maybe we'll start with Holly and work our way over.
My brain is spinning because there's about 18,000, as this whole webinar.
Yeah.
But I would say I think I really come back to work on your goal. If you have a good goal statement that we are trying to raise X amount of dollars by December 31st in order to do this work so that we can have such and such impact, if you can really get your arms around something that feels substantial, specific, meaningful, tangible that you can follow up on down the line. I think that is such a guiding light for an end of year campaign that I would really, it is always time well spent to massage that goal, work it, get in other stakeholders, make sure your leadership feel good about it. Think specifically about it, because it will make so many other elements of planning and especially writing that much easier.
Yeah, I will just go back to message. And I think that goal is part of it. It's sort of it's what are you trying to do? Does it sound meaningful to you? It don't, sort of put everything you read away and speak from the heart. Speak from the emotion. You want to capture your donor and your prospects on an emotional level. And so if you read through it, does it sound kind of robotic? Throw it out, start new, make it mean something, and don't use those kind of buzzy words in development. Just go back down to basics and make it sound as compelling as you possibly can. That's going to matter more than anything.
Yeah, and to kind of play off of that, this is something that I heard consistently throughout grad school, that it's just drilled into my head. And I think it's just a simple reminder is always keep your mission at the heart of what you do. I feel like a lot of the times I often lose sight of that, whether it's my mission or my vision, and I get caught up in a lot of other things. So kind of that simple, come from the heart, make sure you're connecting back to what you're really trying to do is really helpful, especially when there's 17 million things going on.
Definitely. Great. Well, thank you all again for being with us. As I mentioned earlier, we recorded this, so Laura will be sure to send this out to y'all that you all can follow up on. And thank you all again for your time, and have a good rest of the day.